How is everyone tonight?
Marvelous.
All right.
So welcome to our stream tonight on location. It's the four of us tonight. Andy Leask is, who knows where he is? He's taking a break. Tonight we're going to be talking about creating interesting, unique locations, how to develop a location during play, weaving locations into your campaign narrative, and anything else that people would like to ask about either in the comments. I will bring them up. So, Seagoat first with a comment. Weaving locations into RPGs depends on a few things. But what things? I'm sure we'll find out. So, who would like to kick us off with what are we talking about when we talk about locations? Why are they important?
Will I start? Because I tend to always go, woo, I'll start because I can't help myself with my big rabbity voice. Alrighty, locations in RPGs are obviously integral. They are the very scenes upon which our players walk. As if we were to use the play analogy, if you can imagine your nice stage, the locations are the things you're going to be presenting on there for your players to walk through, interact with, engage with. And many of the games that we play present them in quite different ways. Often they're presented in a very curt fashion with small descriptions just so they can get as much into their text as possible. Sometimes they're given a host of more long-winded descriptions so you can get an idea of what the place might smell like or sound like, or indeed taste if your PCs should be so inclined. And let's be honest, we've all had a few PCs who do that.
It reminds me of going to the Jorvik Viking Centre in around, I don't know.
Oh, yes.
1993. And like a reprise a few years ago with our own kids.
The sights and the
smells.
The smells. I remember that very clearly.
They are lovely.
Yes.
And how to best conjure these.
I have been pushing for scratch and sniff in
Scratch and
sniff.
It's true. I mean, Mark will often during our meetings say, we need a scratch and sniff book. Because
of course, in Warhammer, scratch and sniff means something altogether different.
Let's just not go there. How do we, as GMs, create interesting locations? And also, as I think from our perspective, an interesting question for us to tackle is how do we, as creators, create locations for you to then turn into your own pieces of awesome at your table? And I think that's a brief location description starter, so to speak, from me.
So where do you start when you're creating interesting and unique locations? Shall we start with Graham from a writing perspective, and then we can go to Mark and talk about the look and feel of locations?
I shall now lean back.
Or the other way around, if Mark is desperate to jump in. No, he said
well, I always start with what the location's supposed to do, what it brings to the game. Whether it's a building in a city or a room in a dungeon, what's it for? And then that basically informs everything else. What's it for gives me what it is, basically what's there, who's in it, what's in it. And provided you've got I'm a great believer in formats for things like locations. I could hold forth on that for some time. Because then that gives you your form to fill in to make sure that you've got all the pertinent information. And if you've got a good format and a good concept, it basically writes itself.
Well, I'm almost entirely the opposite. I never think about form.
It's why we're such a great team.
I rarely think about what anything is for. For me, it's about the sort of the visual narrative, the hook, and sometimes that's the location, and sometimes it's a character, and then you think about where that character belongs. I try to avoid doing those things in isolation. I try to avoid thinking purely about a location or purely about a character. I think it's the bringing them together that actually sort of amplifies the significance of any location / character combo that you could possibly come up with.
Right.
So yeah, and it could be an adventure hook. I've got a thought about wouldn't it be cool if the character's got to do this. And then the actual practicalities I leave to people who are far better suited, like Graham and Andy, to work that out.
That's what makes us.
I pontificate my genius and let them, sort out the nitty-gritty.
And that's what makes us such a great team, because we come at it from both directions. All the bases are covered, and everything is optimized.
And I come at it from a completely different direction, I would say, again. If I'm presented with building a city or building locations in a city, I'm like an inveterate collector of things. I go to charity shops, I go to, like, I don't know, old curio shops, and I get like old maps and old books and old plans, and I pass them to Andy for inspiration. And I actually got one here as an example.
Props.
This is a pictorial map of Edinburgh and Leith.
Very nice too.
Pretty cute. But what I like to do is I like to kind of have a look and think about the things that you never get in RPGs. So I've got an old map that annoyingly I couldn't find, and it has like a marble refining works on it. And I'm like, well, so this is from Edinburgh in the 1890s. So they're building lots of neoclassical buildings. So they need marble works. So I like to look for the things on maps that you wouldn't really think to have. There's the standard, I don't know, cliche. There's banks, there's pubs and inns. But I like to look for the things that maybe are a little bit less found. So there's one on here I was looking today, and it was the Edinburgh Geographical Institute. So I would take that and I would like to think like what's upstream of that and what's downstream of that. If you've got a geographical institute, you're probably going to have a university in that city, because otherwise you wouldn't have the educated people to have that institute. You've probably got something in or around that city like Edinburgh does. It's got old geology. So there's like Arthur's Seat and there's the castle, and it's interesting and unique geology. Another example would be like somewhere that stuff is dyed, not actually dyed, you know what I mean, like dyed clothes. So that means that it's near a river and there's an effluent from that, and it's a smelly area. And so I like to take unusual locations that you wouldn't usually see and use them to build that location and its surroundings and create the unique story hooks that you might have that you wouldn't see in another game. Andy, you want
from my perspective, because I sort of combine all of these things together in terms of the things that particularly get me. But I'm always looking for how it can be best used in play by a GM, which means that I'm always looking for the really cool, awesome bits that Mark, for example, is adding. I'm always looking for the really cool bits that you wouldn't normally expect to be added to try and bring character to a location or a set of locations that you might not normally consider if you're a GM. And that's something that from the creative side is very important, I feel, particularly where presenting a large number of locations. It's about showing you things that you might not have done yourself. Because it's really easy for us to pull out yet another pub or yet another ad infinitum for all these locations. But also, I'm now going to go back on that slightly and say, I also look for ensuring we do cover all of those and we present them in ways that are either A, very different to what you might have done. So we will present a unique, different version of that thing that you've seen many times before, or alternatively, something that can really easily used and adapted. Because they're often the ones that get used most at the table. Now, from our perspective as creators, they can often be some of the ones that are least interesting to create, because you're looking to always create that cool piece of awesome that we can say, this is the cool thing that drives us forward. But often, if every single pub has got a giant wyvern's wing over it, has got 17 ghosts, has 112 cultists. I almost said something very
then you're probably
in the basement. In the basement, then suddenly, totally that too. But then suddenly they're not interesting anymore because everything has it. And as you're going through your adventures, you almost get that player trepidation of walking into a new location with like, what are we going to end up accidentally encountering this time? Instead of you're at another pub, you're at another inn, you're making your way along the road, and then those fun little side stories pop out. So the side stories that, from our perspective, might appear to be sometimes mundane are often the ones, particularly when you go to cons and you speak to people about how your material has been used, they're often the ones that get used the most. So they're the ones that I often come in and go, look, we've got so much cool, but could we possibly, now I can't even believe I'm going to say this, could we possibly have just a bit less cool and a bit more just story, or a bit more this or a bit less that? And the inevitable response is no. Come on, seriously, get out. But I'll always bring that to the table to make sure that we've at least discussed it.
Yeah.
Seagoat says interesting locations, places that capture a party's interest based on PC's background, likes and dislikes, etc. Easy to create and drop into sessions. And Wolfbane says, I tend to let the players decide what they do. So I create locations with lots of plot hooks, and the players decide what direction the campaign and the location go in. And then here's an interesting one. Locations can be building area based or can be NPC based. Which makes sense. These are the things that the party will interact with, be the basis for a plot hook and the basis for gaming for a few sessions.
I think from the perspective of, because many of those comments there were suggesting that it was almost player-led necessarily than GM-led. GM presents some locations, all of which he's got something prepared for, and they're ready to use those locations depending on how they're presented. But ultimately, player-driven in terms of how they're presented. That's where often we can be the most useful, because we can often present a whole host of hooks for how the individual locations can be used best. Particularly if they are locations which you need to be able to have an almost generica for. How can I just make an inn more interesting without necessarily having described it already? And as a loose just GM tip, whenever you do go into a location, consider whatever your adventure is at hand, assuming you have one. And if your adventure is, let's say, spooky, ensuring that you have some sort of language that reflects that through the course of your locations to support your theme is super, not necessarily important, but it will add that extra layer of depth. What does this place smell like? Is it more isolated than normal? Are there fewer people here because it's spooky, or are more people gathered in the local pub because they don't want to be out at night? So ensuring that whatever your theme for your adventure at hand is reflected in your locations can make a big difference towards characterizing places in the way that you wouldn't initially have normally done so.
Yeah.
Here's
a question. Sorry, Mark. No, you go.
I was going to say, I think it's fine to, you can create here's a generic tavern, but how you choose to dress it with NPCs and with adventure hooks and stuff, you can actually, reuse it countless times, and it's just the way that
Mark,
it's presented.
You sound like you're a realtor selling this tavern. I'm dressing the tavern to sell it to a passing GM. I've heard that the real estate prices have shot up in this area.
Yeah, I think that's yeah. Well, as I was saying before we started the broadcast, I'm getting bombarded by realtors at the moment who want me to sell my house because the prices are through the roof. So maybe that's seeped in now, and I'm thinking on my in concept.
Yeah, it's just the word dress is very like, oh, here's a great idea for a reality TV show. Love it or loot it. I love this. So there are some answers in the comments to this, which actually appeared before this question, but peculiarly they answer it quite well. So let's go to us first, and then we'll I'll pull those comments out. So how do you balance fantastical and unique while still making something feel natural or in universe?
I'll jump since no one immediately jumps. Oh, do you want to go, Graham?
No, you go.
Okay, cool. This is dependent entirely on the setting at hand. Some settings are by their very nature fantastical, so you can go way over the top with almost every location, and indeed each location is almost a character in and of itself, particularly if you're running a relatively short adventure of say 6 to 10 sessions. In that adventure, you're unlikely to have more than maybe 10 locations, which means that you can spend quite a bit of time dressing these and really sinking home what the setting is. But if you're playing something that's a bit more standard medieval-y fantasy, or something that's a bit more grounded in the modern day, and you are looking for a slightly mundane to then contrast the fantastical against, then it's more about the mood and the tone of each one of those locations and how they can be best expressed to support the story that they're about to hit. So, for example, if it's going from the mundane to the fantastic, having those little seeds sown into the locations that you present first that suggest these things might be coming, those little creepy edges, those little details on the corner that look a little bit off, walls that are slightly crooked, or little dark corridors or doors that are a little bit too small. Lots of little details which allow you to support the incoming story. So when it does hit, the contrast is strong, but also it's not a tonal shift that's too heavy.
Mm-hmm. I quite like the idea of to make something feel natural, thinking about the history of that place. So in the real world, obviously there are buildings that are built like a shopping centre that's just built to be a shopping centre, but actually there's often buildings that have been used for multiple things or have lived themselves through multiple periods. An example would be there's a bank branch on Fleet Street in London that has been a bank branch for hundreds of years. And if you went in there, there's like guns on the wall that were used during a riot. There's old safes that were used when the bank was used in a different way. Fleet Street was like 20 meters lower than it was. So if you go down into the basement, you can go on what was the original pavement. Now, if you came into that, you might think that all of those things were in use today, but of course none of them are. They're just remnants of a previous. So not everything has to be there for a reason that's usable right now in the world today. You can build in redundancies and, you know, dead ends of history, and that gives something like a story without having actually to do anything with it.
Well, yeah, it's actually, we're talking about a location without giving anything away. We're talking about a location we're designing at the moment for a sort of a custom purpose, and it was we had the initial pitch. Oh, we should do this, and then over the course of I think it's Andy bouncing ideas around, suddenly it developed. The thing that we thought it was going to be is actually the thing that it was 150 years ago, and now it's this new thing. But you still have all those little touches of history that feed into the narrative that the place has when the player characters arrive in it, and you see all these little hints to its past that feed into the story. I wish I could be more transparent.
I was thinking something.
I'm teasing you. I'm not really telling you.
Darker Days Radio, and I think this is a really good answer to the question that Darker Days Radio probably didn't mean to answer because the comment came before. But so something fantastical and unique, but still feels natural. Geographical location is an influence on how a location operates. Like cities spring in places because of water or access to resources. This is why you find cities near fault lines, because of the geology related to water and it being clean. So I think if you make fantastical locations, things that are really unique, as long as you've thought about the way they interweave. So as I said, like what's upstream of them, what's downstream of them. I don't mean like literally on the river. I mean in the production chain, or, you know, if it's a factory, well, it's going to have, if it's not a modern city, it's going to have buildings for people to live nearby because they can't travel that far. And so that slowly but surely builds the area as well, which then comes on to, I think, for cities though, because there's a bare minimum for the operation of a city. You can cover the basics with random tables and then focus in on those atypical locations.
Yeah, that'd be a good way
definitely.
I've got an extra detail. Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Andy.
No, you sure?
Yeah.
My one's super short. To support what Mark said. Oh God, now I forgot what I was going to say. No, you go, Graham.
Okay, I was going to say, going back to what Darker Days Radio said about access to water and stuff like that. You know, cities on rivers and what have you. That's great. Understand the norm, and then if you want to make something truly fantastical, you know what the rules are. You can break them. It's like Picasso having to learn to draw before he invented Cubism, and that contrast gives you the sort of feeling of the fantastical at full effect.
I saw a thing. Sorry, I was just gonna. This is a random interjection. Sorry, but I saw a thing that Brian Blessed met Picasso when Brian Blessed was a boy, and Picasso gave him a picture of a horse, and Brian Blessed gave it back because it didn't look enough like a horse.
It was rubbish. Yes,
I'll draw you a horse.
He's like, that's not a horse.
Anyway, as I was going to say, I'll first agree with Graham and add a little extra point on top of his one, which is as you add your fantastical elements, I can't stress enough how, as a GM, always consider what has become the new norm because of those fantastical elements, and then consider the impact that's going to have on the standard people that are living in those areas. Because when you present a different version of how buildings are built or how people live because of the nature of the world or the setting that you're working in, players always appreciate it. They go, oh, I see why that is that because of this. Oh, that's really clever. And it's those little clever additions that make the place feel more real. The classic, most frequently referred version of that is if you have giant flying creatures you can ride, walls suddenly become less important for many reasons, but more important for others. And how exactly would that impact your siege warfare? And then using that in terms of how you present the locations that are perhaps combating that is important. So yeah, to support that one, I'll do my other point after.
Also, if you have giant creatures that can ride, then you might have the equivalent of like old school helipads, and the idea of a penthouse and building taller might be more conceivable than if you don't have things that can get you to the top of buildings and you have to climb up them.
Taller buildings.
Yeah, that's true. That's one of the great things about Eberron, the D&D setting, that was overtly inspired by 30s pulp, and Keith Baker, the designer, just got magical equivalents for trains and planes and everything else, and so you ended up with Shun, which is one of the big cities in that setting, and it is a city of towers, and pretty much everybody wears a ring of feather falling because you have to.
So Seagoat says, should it be a location, or should it be description? The description helps to drive the story, and we mentioned how important description is when we did the city episode.
I'll add a small bit in terms of what we do that perhaps is slightly different to the average GM way of looking at this, and it supports what Mark was saying earlier about adding extra layer of depth to your locations. From our perspective, when we're trying to make sure that what we present to you is useful, not only the adventure hook's useful, and not only is the history useful, but having contrasting versions of the history is useful, because that means if you play one type of game, you can say, I'll take this bit and I'll add it in to describe my location. But if you play a very different type of game, you can take the other bit or the other bit. So having different versions of its past and bringing them up as different spikes in its description from our side when we're presenting the locations can make quite a big difference from the GM side, where they then look at it and say, well, all this bit here is useless to me, but this bit here, that's gold. And that's what we're always looking for when we're creating something new. It's creating those nuggets of gold that will work at your table, and it is different for everybody's table, because everybody's got a different version of what they think is perfect.
Darker Days Radio says, I think to balance it, you might need to have a sense of the ecosystem. I guess that's kind of what I was trying to get across with upstream and downstream understanding. So, for example, in Soulbound, we know the city of Hammerhal, actually, because it is in the Realm of Fire, has little access to fresh water. That comes through via a realm gate, and that is then used for lots of uses. In turns, the output of that use creates products that go out of the city. There's a question here from Wolfsbane. Do you have favourite locations to create? My favourite location to build in any game is a hospital, because they are so fluid, versatile, and organic, with both the location and the people changing. You can also get a lot of good stuff in a hospital. Love it or loot it. That would work in a hospital.
I love it or loot it.
Yeah, and all kinds of different plots. Yeah, lovely. I have a sort of a class, I guess, of locations that I like to create, which is the unexpected kind. So going back to Marienburg in White Dwarf, I did a tannery and a leather shop and a guy who wrote letters for people. And it's partly at the time, I will admit, I was showing off the fact that I'd studied medieval and pre-industrial technology in college, and I wanted to make sure these were all presented the way that they actually worked. But when it works out well, you can create a place that no one would ever think of, but they would go, oh yeah, that should be in a city or in whatever location. And more than that, you can give it a lot of really unexpected NPCs, plot hooks, and that sort of surprise factor, the novelty of that helps. I mean, it's partly what we're trying to keep fresh as well when we do yet another inn. Always have surprises. So yeah, I rambled a bit, but that's my answer.
Yeah. So Seagoat says, once we have locations or ideas of location, it's the plot hooks that are built around the location that allows it to be of use in your game. What about you, Andy? Do you have favourite locations?
I do, actually. And sadly, they're somewhat similar to Graham's. So that makes for significantly less interest in terms of repeating it. Yeah, exactly. Boring. I like creating the stuff that would be there that everyone has forgotten about, because they're so caught up with their barracks, they're so caught up with their towers and their inns and their universities if they're going down that, or their particular character class buildings. So this is the training school for bards or some equivalent. I like looking at all the extras that people forget about and building interesting, cool stories around those. So that, which is largely what Graham said. So
what about you, Mark? Tell me something interesting.
No, I don't have a. I certainly don't have a favorite location as a rule. It for me it often starts with sort of an adventure hook. I pitched one just this last week. I popped up something in the Discord. Say, hey, how about this? Because I saw a photo, an old photo of a character that I really liked. And well, we could make this a thing.
It was
make this a thing, and everybody said, yeah. So from I don't. There's absolutely no favorites. It can be an adventure hook. It can be a character type. It can be a prop. It can be just an object that I think might spin up into an interesting location. So for me, it can be it can start with something really small and then we grow it up into an interesting location.
I'll also say that one of the things I quite like doing with locations in their presentation is splitting the information up so that the GM can easily access it. Now, this is obvious that all games do this, but for example, ensuring that the key description of a location doesn't hold its secrets. So that means that you can be certain when you're reading the description that you know everything that you're reading is largely going to be known by the players. Should they encounter this location, get involved with it, or ask people about it, this is the information they're likely to get. And then when you move to your adventure hooks, that's where you sink into your 94 cultists in the basement. We just stress that word, cultists, or something that might be sitting in the roof, or some old ghost, or that patch of damp on the corner, which is actually a doorway to a new dimension. If you hide those inside adventure hooks, it makes it a lot easier for GMs to parse as they're using it. But often, particularly for information like that, the GMs or the person reading it might not realize that information has been segregated on their behalf, because it's my job to try and make it as easy for you as possible without necessarily putting huge signposts over everything, because that can just interrupt the flow of the words too. But that's one example of the things that I particularly enjoy doing, is also trying to present what appears to be mundane locations with little hints running through the core text, and then when you hit the actual thing and going, holy crap, it is a what now? That's also quite fun.
Certainly is.
Darker Days Radio says they like describing all the industry in a sector. So, for instance, for Iron Kingdoms, coming up with all manner of chemical works, some making waterproofing coatings, others refining powder for paints, etc. But like Graham, that's me using my chemistry background for plausible alchemical-driven industry.
There's nothing wrong with that.
No. So here's a question. Sorry, Andy, on you go.
No, go.
So here's a question from Seagoat. Is it more difficult to build a location for system agnostic games, as your location has to be useful for more than one system?
Not the way I do it. I always start with the concept and then figure out the mechanics and the numbers later. But others may be different. I mean, maybe sometimes an idea for a location is suggested by a particular mechanic in a particular game, but I'd say that's very much the exception.
For me, it's a bit of both. I find it freeing because I'm no longer constrained by a certain set of entities, creatures, backgrounds, geologies, whatever it may be that the setting itself brings to hand if you're writing for an individual setting. But equally, sometimes stories lend themselves particularly well to individual settings. To use Warhammer as an example, the Chaos Gods are almost rife with ideas that come from each of them, and they automatically slot into each other. So if you've got a particular cultist of Nurgle, you immediately know how that's going to react, and it's short code for just saying the word Nurgle can often cut out having to write 150 words worth of description as to what sort of cult this is. You just say it's a Nurgle cult, job done. All you need to then do is say how it's uniquely expressing, which cuts out so much spraff. So when you're writing more generically, you find that you have to add more detail in to describe key concepts you might not need to do if you're doing it for a more focused setting. It's harder and easier.
Darker Days Radio says, I think if you have some form of keywords and non-system related metrics, size, amount, frequency, the agnostic stuff can work in any setting. And indeed, we've looked at that for NPCs.
Yeah.
So what do we do when elves are extremely long-lived, almost immortal in one system, but are not in another? Humans have different, so we haven't been giving, say, numerical ages.
Right.
Or height differs from system to system. So
It does.
we'll just say tall or short, and then you can apply what that means for a tall human, a tall elf in the system that you're using.
Yeah. Short for an elf might mean, depending on what system that you're playing.
Exactly.
I mean, the other thing I would say with system agnostic stuff is that we certainly find ourselves feeling our way when it comes to levels of sort of anachronism with the technology and stuff. Well, how far do we want to go down? What we're going to say is okay within our world, and will this be okay in most fantasy settings? Or are we actually going to say, well, this is an alternative? You might like to think about if your world has the black powder or has whatever it might be, but then you can make these characters like this. So you can make this technology. You can apply it to the full extent, or you might want to rein back on some of that stuff. And so making sure that we give GMs and players then the options, giving them plenty of stuff to play around with, and making sure that certainly with the locations that it encompasses that sort of breadth of universe.
Julius Statius says, my favorite to create is almost always mailing systems or any kind of good transport system. They're often a great way to see how your world is different or alike to our own.
You are going to like something we've created. And when I say you're going to like it, you're going to love it. It's great. That's all I'm going to say. That's coming soon to a book near you. But holy cremolians, it's brilliant. We've all added different bits to this particular thing, of which I'm not discussing too much. And I think the outcome of it it's just great. I'm just going to sum up with that. And
I know what you're talking about now. I've just realized.
I've
just clicked. I once used a mug and growled into it so the players knew just how bad the dog they hadn't yet met
That's an important thing to do for all locations. Yes. In fact, I'm going to riff on this slightly and say that something I alluded to right near the beginning is super important for characterizing your locations, and that's remembering the senses. And again, if you tie those senses into whatever the theme of the adventure you're about to embark upon is, and that might just be, I'm going to follow these adventure hooks that I've read and I'm going to embellish at a later point. What's the primary tones and themes of these? And ensuring that they are reflected in the senses that you present makes an enormous difference. Even if your inn is just got a lovely brewy smell in comparison to piss all over the hay-strewn floor or vomit, or perhaps it's fresh and it smells of clean wood because it's recently been upholstered. We put cloth over everything, or it's recently been refurbished, which is what I was looking for. All of these things can make a significant difference, and just dropping in a couple of these words can allow you to create unique locations without having to go in depth. And if later you want to then add the extra detail because the PCs have decided that this location is the center of their adventure, whether you want it to be or not, this is where they're going to focus everything. You've already sown a few seeds that clearly they've grabbed onto, that hopefully you can germinate and turn into something that's unique and interesting that will hopefully bolster your story.
Wolf Spain says, never forget the bed bugs. I had a character who was one on a penance in the wilderness with the Countess of Nuln. It's a long story, and the bed bugs were the first warning that little town had fallen to Nurgle. So always watch out for bed bugs.
Always watch out for
that is
bed
my
bugs.
top tip. So Long Shadow Games says, it's nice to have evocative descriptions for everything, but if every location has a description that has been dialed up to 11, won't that dilute the impact of your really important locations?
Well, it depends what you mean by 11.
Well, it's 11. It's higher than 10.
It's one louder, yeah. But if everything is up to 11 in one sense, everything's the same volume. But if you treat 11 as a multiplier, say, and you're starting with a fairly mundane location, I'm not sure if this point is going to get across or if I'm just being an idiot here, but
I can feel my eyes glazing over.
Yeah. What I meant to say was that a level 11 description of a mundane location is going to be considerably less exciting than a level 11 description of a really fantastical location, just because of what you've got to work with. So to some extent, it sorts itself out.
I mean, I kind of know what Long Shadow's getting at, I think, in terms of, so you walk down the street of a city and you've got, like, I don't know, the marble finishers and the Geographical Institute and the alchemical and you, everything is unique and unusual, and then you don't just have the mundane alongside it. But I think when we're talking about the mundane, it's what can you do to add interest for the GM and plot hooks into even those mundane locations that make them, you know, stand out from the crowd and not just be another
I go slightly further. Every NPC is interesting in their own way. I think the dialed up to 11 is perhaps Las Vegas syndrome, where you go down Las Vegas and everything is boom, boom, ha ha, boom, pyramids, Eiffel Tower, laid one after the other in a variety of ridiculous over-the-top ways. And for some settings, that's fine. If you're playing a Warhammer 40k role-playing game, the number of settings that are dialed up to 11 and number of locations, that are dialed up to 11, it's almost all of them. They're rarely happy just to present a hive. It's going to be a hive on the back of a giant beetle-like monstrosity making its way through a sluffish desert of hell, because all of the locations are dialed up by an extra one, because it's almost like the writers are competing sometimes to create the most 40k thing they possibly can. And they often then get reflected into the adventures. And I think that Long Shadow Games' point here is strong, and that is, if you are attempting to build up towards something, you do have to be careful that you don't make everything feel like that unless that's appropriate for the setting at hand. If you're just playing your standard fantasy game that builds up tension towards a horrific end, dialing it up to 11 for each step along the way will perhaps detract from the finale. But again, it's dependent on the setting, and that also doesn't mean that you can't create really interesting NPCs with backgrounds that are of interest that might attract a different style of adventure as you're going. But again, it really is dependent on the adventure you're presenting. It's hard to say yes or no to that.
Yeah, I think there's also the assumption that there are kind of really boring places in between the interesting locations. We just don't talk about them because they're so bloody boring.
Yeah. And you'll often find if you're... I was going to say, just to finish off that point, if you are presenting, say, a district, you often find that those locations are caught up in the first couple of paragraphs where it says, there's lots of this type of building in this area. Job done, and here's the cool.
Yeah, so it's Will Smith says it's hard to have an investigative style adventure if only the important locations / NPCs are interesting.
Yes, agreed.
True.
Yeah. I'd be interesting. Sorry, Graham.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say I'd be interested to see how Neverland presents its locations. I haven't picked it up yet, the new RPG, because everything in Neverland is presumably going to be like weird and something that was in the books. So anyway, that's just a side note.
Just as a side note to that as well, I once wrote quite a lot of bits for the Grimm RPG, which is basically the fairy tale RPG. And again, similarly, every single character is dialed up to 11 in that in its own respective way. Most of them are murderers, gut openers, and various other horrible fairy tale Grimm realizations of how they present. But there was a bit of that problem with it, in that every single thing that your PCs met, you were immediately super hesitant of, to the point that you were like, nope, hard nope to that and hard nope to everything else, which left the players in an odd place. You had to ensure that the players were primed to engage, or everything would just fall apart. So
yeah, that's kind of what I'm getting at with Neverland, because Neverland is like your classic, the Lost Boys were always on an adventure every day. There was nothing mundane about their lives ever. So curious to know if anyone's played that and how they find it. Graham, sorry, you've been trying to...
That's okay. That comment actually made me think, because there's one thing about a location in an adventure filling a specific need, whereas a location in a source book that's been designed to fulfill many, many different needs is a slightly different animal. And going up to 11 in a source book is, I think, more forgivable because it presents a range of possibilities for the GM to use depending on the needs of whatever adventure they set there. Whereas a location that's in an adventure and of an adventure, then, you know, it might need to be a 6 or a 7, or else, yeah, everything's gonna be just too loud.
Yeah, so if everything is epic, nothing is epic. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
But you can reinforce that, particularly from the writing side, where you can get yourself your narrative thread and the locations that are presented through it. But if you're looking to ensure that those locations can be used by GMs in different ways, you can then add adventure hooks for some of those locations as an aside to the core text, which means that not only do you engage with that and then you go around to this person's townhouse and you see something else. If, for example, there's a combat in that townhouse, it'll be quite common for that townhouse to then have some sort of plan or map that can be used on a virtual tabletop or printed out and dropped on your table. Then having a couple of adventure hooks, not necessarily for that townhouse, but for other townhouses that could be using those locations, means that we can have our cake and eat it as writers. Where we can both present the mundane and then we can present the not so mundane and then possibly present our gateway through to another dimension with 93 cultists in the basement.
Yeah.
So, yeah, Darker Days Radio says mundane areas are perhaps described with broad strokes and procedural generation of the things that fill, say, one slum versus another. Then here's another one, which I'm sure will chime with most of us. Sometimes your players won't pay attention to your dialed up location and will spend 4 sessions in a less detailed location just because they liked one small detail about it.
Very true.
This is almost always what happens. And it's why when I go to cons, it's quite common for people to come up and say, you know, that thing what you did write almost nothing about and you did this for. Yep. Well, we've made it this. And you're like, oh, wow, that's a thing. And then it's often surprising for me to see the reactions to material that I thought was perhaps less interesting. And often it'd be the one that's most used and is perceived to be most interesting. And the ones that I felt were super cool, because they're often down to taste. They're the ones that are often selected by GM. So a GM might ignore, say, 7 of those super cool things and then take the 8th, which means only 1 in 8 of those things are used. For the more mundane things, they're using them all because it's stuff that can slot into almost everything.
Yeah, there's also an aspect of opportunity to this as well, because if a location is described in fantastical detail, it gives less scope for people to have their own ideas about it.
Inspiring rather than restricting.
Exactly.
Bringing the cool to the table.
And Long Shadow Games, it says one location can be both mundane at one moment then dialed up at another. For example, the scene of a murder might be a really boring building until the crime has been committed and suddenly it's very interesting. There's a question up here, which I'll get to, but this one, I'm really sorry, I don't know how to pronounce an L with a dash through it. Is that Michal?
I think it's a dark L.
Anyway, to the point about detailed descriptions, as a GM, I really appreciate when good level of detail is provided about every location, not just about locations key to the adventure.
Yeah, I think that's even if it's only a few extra sentences, it can make a big difference. It was one of the things that, if we take a clean example, when we're organizing Rough Nights and Hard Days, and we're going through, should we make any changes to adventures that have been presented previously, which about half of them had. The general idea was to look at the NPCs, for example, and make sure that they all had a few extra lines of description in them, explaining where they came from, who they were, not necessarily just for those NPCs, but to inspire GMs with those details to create their own NPCs, which could be presented in a similar way. Because it's quite possible those NPCs may be encountered for a few moments during the course of that adventure, but you still have those NPCs you can then uplift and drop into your games at a later date. And exactly the same goes for locations. Even if you just drop in those few extra details, it can make a big difference for the GM in terms of prep time later, should they need to have a quick in. Suddenly I've got myself a 6-7 location in that I can just drop into any area at all, which was something that Graham and I discussed quite a bit, for example, when we were talking about, say, an enemy in shadows and we're presenting the inn there. We put we did the full description rather than just doing a quick cursory. It's an inn, they're there, let's get to the important shit. We went, no, it's an inn, and these are the bits of the inn. And yes, that may be a bit mundane, but this stuff is super important if your players decide they want to go through all these other locations, which players, being players, inevitably will. They're going to dive out that window into that stable. But if you don't know there's a stable there or why the stable's there, it requires a couple of extra lines of description to allow you to ground it in reality.
So here's a question, but before we get to the question, public service announcement.
It's Mihao. Well done.
It is Mihao. So if you encounter it again, you will know, and you won't need to be silly like me. So
Thanks,
where did
Mihao.
that? Thanks, Mihao. Oh no, now I've lost my map one. Well, when do you start making a map is the question. Here we are, Yusarian. At what point do you start making a map, and at what point do you go from the changing work in progress map to it's like this? Is that like, when do you finalize your map?
It is a funny one. I have been at literally every step of development here, from just the writers doing it to map makers coming in first to a mixture of the pair and it developing in sync. Generally speaking, the writers will put everything in place and then write around their simple map that they've created. And then it will, generally speaking, go to a cartographer to nail down. So it often isn't nailed down until the writing is completely finished, edited, and resolved. But sometimes that means that they've not necessarily thought through the places that they've created. And then when it comes to someone like me who might be mapping it, I go, but that doesn't make sense. There's 10 yards missing in this particular wall because they've described this. Or there's literally nowhere that they can go and poo. I mean, it's a really simple thing, but I have gone for that one on purpose because
that put in an extra window.
yeah. That popped up in Ship of Fools where the playtesters went, "Where's the head? There's nowhere for everyone to poo," and we went, "Well, yeah, let's fix that." So broadly speaking, sketch maps are exactly that. Details aren't pinned down until all words are finished, because then you know you'll never contradict the words and the words won't change later. And then once the map's in place, it goes through a series of approvals with everybody that's involved with it to make sure that nothing's been forgotten.
And what do we think about a location map? Do you like a location map?
Depends on the location. Sometimes it's restrictive, as Graham was saying earlier, regarding the creation of your own versions of locations. But for some things, if it's in an adventure, say, they can often be essential just to help contextualize where everybody is in, say, a combat encounter or something similar.
I think they're also useful to show kind of what a location contains, what kind of rooms and areas are necessary for a workshop of this particular craft, for example. And you know, and people might redraw them for their own reuse, but at least they've got a checklist of what's there, and there's always a place to poo.
I always like a location map because I find it quite hard. I find it quite easy to visualize places. So I'm not like our missing Rook who finds it hard to, or doesn't have has aphantasia, but I find it quite hard to like connect rooms together and know where I am in a spatial location. So I do quite like that. Darker Days Radio has given a link here, a great map generation on the fly link.
Yeah, that's quite a good one. It's also worth saying as well, from the perspective of when do you create your own maps at home when you're doing it, I generally recommend straight away, just if you're making your own ones for your own GM stuff at home, just make your map, because then at least you know exactly the place you're doing. Often you'll find that can replace prep. Because if you've got the map in place and you've referenced another couple of maps, you no longer need to worry about where everything is, or indeed how that inn presents. You've got all the basic shapes. If the players go through doors, you can say how many doors or windows or whatever, should you be that sort of GM who describes such things with ease, because you've got them all there already. And then you can add whatever necessary descriptors on top are required to support the adventure that you plan everyone to go on. And then they go in a completely different direction.
I would do that. When I was back in the day, running campaigns as a teenager, one of the first things I would do at a camp at the start of the campaign is do a map, and it would be just all the ideas and random locations and stuff I had in my head, and knowing that the players would be starting at the bottom of the map, I wouldn't have to worry about what was going on in that skull mountain I'd drawn in the top right corner. But man, But it was interesting. Oh, look at this world! Look at this world! Look at all these cool places we can go. And I had no idea what was going to happen in them, but I figured I had a fair amount of time to work on that before they ever got there.
So here's a question. A lot of campaigns start in stereotypical taverns. We've talked about that before. Why do you think this is? And do you think other more interesting locations can be used to offer the same dynamics? Why do you think that is?
It's an easy why. It's because it's a social gathering place. Often you've got characters who might be from disparate backgrounds, and you're looking for a reason for them all to be getting together. And generally, anywhere that's social is an automatic, easy spot where that could be. Another classic one that some use in some adventures is wherever work starts. So whether it's like a poster board where various jobs are available, or whether it's something similar inside your world, it's somewhere where the PCs can gather, say hello to each other, and hopefully go. Some adventures start in media res. You don't need to worry about that. They just start when everyone's getting down with whatever it is that's happening. But it is very common for almost any party to start in some sort of place where everyone would get together, because
do you think
it's influenced?
Do you think it's influenced by TV? I mentioned this before. The idea, like, if you think about Friends, it's like in their apartment or it's in that coffee shop. Like, are we programmed from watching so much TV to think of people gathering in places that are like sets?
It's every soap opera,
possibly,
right?
yeah.
Every weekly soap, there's a pub. It's whether it's the Rover's Return in Coronation Street or the Queen Vic in EastEnders, or everywhere has some sort of social hub. You know, because it's just, again, it's convenient, isn't it?
It is, you know, and it serves a sociological purpose going back centuries. It's not too much of a stretch, but it has become a bit of a cliche in gaming.
Yeah.
And so that's why, for example, in starting off Shadows over Bogenhafen, I invented the Schaffenfest because people would be coming from all around, and I figured there'd be a hiring fair there, which was quite common at medieval fairs and festivals, and just to get away from that cliche.
So basically, you sent them to a festival which is just many pubs and tents.
That too, yes, there is that.
Temporary pub.
You tend to find, though, when it comes to adventure writing, to go against that, rather than choosing a location, they often choose a situation. So this is the situation that has dragged your party together. It often might be the job at hand. In an attempt often to try and avoid you're all in a pub and, which is rarely a good start.
Darker Days Radio says, I hate starting games in taverns, kill your Gandalf. Start in media res in some locations. Starting them off with danger already in process stops the ums and ahs of engaging in a mission. Yeah, our party really needs that.
I'll add that this was particularly when I commission adventures, this is something that I'll often stress near the beginning. Make sure that the hook, whatever that's dragging people into the adventure, is very strong. Now, we know that that's all very obvious, particularly from those of us who are creating material. You have to make sure that the initial hook to get everyone involved is strong. But I can't stress it enough. If you don't have something that binds the party together at the beginning, you will find them going in a completely different direction, often tearing after something that's no longer important. And there's quite a lot of really good adventures which start just weakly enough that those adventures are never quite realized.
So the entire party starts in hospital as they all come down with the galloping trots from their previous inmate.
Yeah!
And in Wrath and Glory, the away team would always start either on the bridge or in the banquet room of Road Trader, and that just meant lots of description of 40k food.
Yeah, but you see, with something like a 40k role-playing game, you know where everybody came from. And, I think one reason the Fantasy Inn cliche came up was, as Andy said, it's a social area. It's where anybody could have a reason for being there. And it's where a bunch of strangers could come together and form a party of adventurers. And that's a little trickier to arrange in other situations than one might expect, at least without a lot of background writing.
Yeah, Darker Days Radio says, also, depending on the economy of the game, this can allow you to bypass the excruciatingly boring shopping for mundane gear. I mean, when absolutely. Andy Law is GMing for us and he says something like, do you have a rope? I mean, my standard answer is always yes. Obviously. Why wouldn't I have a rope? Do you have the antidote to this very specific poison? Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Duh.
I think, though, there is an important line there, which is depending upon the economy of the game, because some games very much center on making sure that you have time to go pick up your stuff from various places and then come back to the adventure to go and do it. Sometimes it's done in downtime. Sometimes it's done during the game itself, which can be quite the mood killer depending upon the nature of how that's presented at the table. But it's also incumbent upon us, particularly if we're creating generic adventures, and that's a terrible term. Adventures that can be used by any setting.
We told you we have banned the G word from our
and I said it too, didn't I? I did. Sorry. But if we are presenting adventures that can be used in any setting, we've got to make sure that we do cover those moments for those settings so that there are opportunities for people to pick up those things along the way, primarily because they might be playing in a game where that's very much part of the actual process, but without spending too much time dwelling on that, because it can be for many a game mundane and dull. So ensuring those little loops are left in place while simultaneously presenting all the cool, unique individual locations as we go is pretty important.
So giving the group a stipend place to grab reloads easily, that's where a base is useful, so you can focus on the more unusual gear where they do go shopping. And Zoltan says, if you have a large location like a ruined large castle with underground passages, not every room may have an interest, and only limited points will be used. In such case, I find that no map is better, as you're more free in your description and can avoid room by room.
I agree with that completely. The number of locations that I've encountered which have mapped everything out and there was nothing in all of that everything. And that's fine if they then use that everything for something else. So, for example, a nice, fun, interesting set of adventure hooks, which can use those locations in a different way. But if you're just presenting this big empty place with nothing in it, you're as well using that space for something that the GM can use in a different way. Now, some people will use that map and say the map alone was worth it because I can use that in my games repeatedly. And there's an argument there. But from the perspective from us trying to create some useful, interesting, insightful stuff, you can pick up those maps from just a heritage shop. You'll get that from just your average map.com. We're better trying to bring something that you'll go, wow, I got this. This is great. Rather than, I've got a map of a castle.
And here's a final question, but we've only got 4 minutes left, so we may not. We might need to revisit this. If we're talking about starting locations for PCs to meet up and band together, do you draw inspiration from books and films? For instance, Platform 9 3/4, Luke going in search for a missing astromech droid and meeting a certain crazy old fool, etc.
I'll keep my answer short then. Yes.
Mine's just a short no. But now I'm thinking about it.
Maybe yes.
I think so. I think certainly if you're playing with a group of players and you give them, you frame it in your own interesting way, but you give them a location that has a sort of resonance. I think that's kind of potentially really engaging as a jumping off point for players at the start of an adventure. It's kind of if you can a train station, a sort of a farmstead on a desert planet, you know what I mean? You touch all these, a spaceport full of a hive of scum and villainy. Those are great little. It just kickstarts the imaginative process. But I think that sort of reference can be really useful.
I'll add a small, just to finish off on that one. I just add a small. In each one of those situations, there's something to do. There's something that drags the players together because they've got a job to do, whatever it may be. Like, for example, I've got to catch the train. And through doing that, you immediately create locations. Like, for example, in Ship of Fools, we've got to catch a boat to get things kicked off. And yes, drawing inspiration from pretty much anywhere, as far as I'm concerned, is well worth doing. Because you don't want to repeat that same old tired trope of starting and again and again and then again.
It's funny how the phrase "catch a boat" made me think of lassoing a boat in a way that "catch a train" didn't.
Although now I've got images hanging off.
Water skiing after the ferry. Wait for me.
That's a location.
Before water skiing, there was skiing behind horses.
That's the truth.
There's races for skiing behind horses in Poland. Apparently, I saw it on a TV show the other day. Anyway. Yeah, exactly. Lasso a train, pair of roller boots, sorted. So that brings us to the end of our hour. Almost, who would have thought that we were so obsessed with real estate?
Yeah.
It is the human condition.
It is.
So, what are we talking about next week? I will pop the little advert up after we've finished, but we are talking about mini games. That's to the tune of Monorail from
Of course.
The Simpsons, if you didn't catch that.
Yeah, totally.
Did you not? Okay, well,
No,
now
I
you know.
don't.
When I go around the house, that's Darker Days. I'm going to loot it, Kirsty. You certainly are. Anyway, on that note, we shall see you all next week. And until then, enjoy the rest of your Saturday or whatever day you're watching us on the playback. Speak to you all soon.
Bye.
Bye.